morning. Thanks for joining us on Friday, November the 7th, 2025. So the budget's finally here. Prime Minister Carney tabled the budget on November the 4th, and really there wasn't any surprises, no real excitement. Um, I think the deficit was a little bit less than what people were talking about, but we'll talk about that. We'll dig into that. We learned a lesson in accounting between the operating budget and the capital budget. He's splitting those two hairs together to try to make things work. Some creative accounting on Prime Minister Carney's part. He's seen a lot of budgets. He's done a lot of budgets, but he's always been the person to really approve the budget. Here, that's not the case. He's got to get the House to approve it, and that's the challenge. So let's get started. Let's dig into this and find out what's in the budget. I have three articles up on the screen. One from Global News, another one from The Hill, another one from St. Albert Gazette. From Global News, Carney's first budget aims to balance generational spending with cuts. We'll talk more about that. From The Hill, the budget 2025, Carney got the right diagnosis, but the wrong prescription for Canada's economy. We'll talk about that. And from the St. Albert Gazette, Liberal budget earmarks billions of dollars for bold and swift action to meet the U.S. disruption. And on November the 4th, which is this week, Prime Minister Carney tabled his first federal budget as Prime Minister of Canada, aiming to reset the Canadian economic agenda for Canada. The budget is billed as a generational investment to respond to the global economic shocks, trade disruption, especially from the United States, and production headwinds. It makes a major pivot away from the past priorities, like from the Justin Trudeau era, a shift from purely redistribution and transfer spending to heavy infrastructure, productive and competitiveness investment throughout the Canadian economy. Introduction of new fiscal frameworks separating, here we go, operating from capital expenditures, allowing ongoing deficits for capital investment while aiming to balance the operating budget by 2028, 2029. So I guess what he's doing is he's segregating what he's calling the operating budget is day-to-day expenses and revenue coming in to run the government. And he's going to take savings, which we're going to talk about in the major numbers here, but he's basically going to take savings from the operating and throw it into the capital budget to invest in infrastructure and other vehicles to get our economy to pivot away from the United States and be more productive within Canada. The focus is for trade diversification and reducing our dependence, Canada's dependence on the U.S. economy, investing billions to make Canada a more attractive investment destination for businesses around the world. Major numbers. New spending approximately $142 billion over 5 years. Projected federal deficit for 2025 to 2026 is about $78 billion, up from the previous $42 billion. So that's almost doubled. And that is mostly because of infrastructure spending, housing. He's going to spend money on housing, the defense, meeting the NATO commitments and getting a large boost in that. And roughly $115 billion will be going to infrastructure, $25 billion into housing over 5 years. Some cost control efficiency elements to the budget that were highlighted, which targeting cuts or attrition, but mostly cuts from the federal public service, approximately ready 40,000 positions over several years, savings of about $51 billion over 5 years to offset some new spending in what he's calling the the operating and capital budget. The reaction and the risk to all of this, obviously, analysts say that the budget acknowledges structural problems within the Canadian economy as it relates to internal trade barriers and productivity, but relies heavily on government spending rather than unleashing the private sector growth. So basically, what he's trying to do is he's trying to show investors and companies around the world that Canada is willing to take its own money invested into Canada for infrastructure to change and pivot the economy. And hopefully, with that, they're going to attract additional investment into Canada as a partnership between the private sector and the government. Political risk as a minority government, as far as the Liberals go, they need to get the support. At least at the time of the budget, they needed 3 votes from the opposition. Now it's down to 2 votes. One of the Conservative members crossed the aisle. We're going to talk about that. That'll be tomorrow's episode. Crossed the aisle to the Liberals. So now they gained a vote. So they're now 2 away from becoming a majority government, which then they don't need anybody. So they need 2 votes from the other side of the aisle. Some critics say that more continuing change and raising spending and deficits will put the Canadian economy at high risk. So that is what was tabled. So now let's take a look at maybe 6 highlighted points of the budget and dig into the budget just a little more so that we have a clear understanding of what Prime Minister Carney is trying to achieve. So now I have some bullet points up there, about 5 of them on the screen. The first one is the budget marks a radical shift towards productivity, but maintains government centralist approach. So productivity appears 129 times in the budget document, and is a significant departure from the Trudeau government's emphasis on equity and redistribution, which is a traditional socialist democratic view. Number 2, the deficit is set to double, driven entirely on increased spending at roughly 2% of GDP annually over 5 years. The deficit reflects deliberate policy choices rather than revenue shortfalls. So it's not that we are not bringing money in. We've made a decision that we are going to spend money on these projects and these initiatives to change our economy. It has nothing to do with us not bringing in enough revenue. The danger is that they may increase taxes to bring in more revenue if there's a shortfall in the money they are saving to offset the capital expenses into the capital budget. And that's the difference. 3, spending cuts are modest compared to Trudeau-era expansion, while the budget projects to reduce the federal workforce by 40,000 positions. This only partially reverses the more than 110 employees increase under the previous government. Can you believe that? Prime Minister Trudeau increased the public sector by 110,000 employees. Can you imagine the salaries, the benefits, the pensions that Canada is paying out to all those employees? So now 40,000 have to be shed. And I'm quite sure, one, those people are not going to be happy. Unions are not going to be happy because then they're not going to be collecting union dues from those employees. Number 4, industrial carbon price will become more stringent, not less. So yes, there was no mention of dropping the emissions cap. There was no talk about increasing oil production cap. There was no talk about getting rid of the tanker ban in the Western Coast. There's no talk about any of that. How can you build economic projects if you don't lift those particular environmental restrictions or at least lessen them so that private sector can see a movement towards building pipelines, ports for tankers and other infrastructure that's required for Canada to be able to pivot away from the United States. Didn't hear any of that. Number five, so basically, it's going to be hard for the opposition party to swallow this budget because there's increased spending for the Conservatives. There's nothing there for the Bloc at all. And they've already said they're not voting for the budget. And the NDP, they can't be for it because the union's losing 40,000 members. It's going to be a hard pill for the opposition, each of them to swallow, but more so for the NDP and the Conservatives. The Conservatives right now, we'll talk about it tomorrow, but there seems to be some cracks in the pavement for the leader of the opposition, Pierre Poilievre, and we'll talk more about that tomorrow. But it's serious stuff for Pierre, for sure. Finally, I really didn't hear anything that just made me fall off my chair on this budget. We knew the deficit was going to be high. We knew that there was going to be quote unquote sacrifices made. Now we know that it's going to be 40,000 public sector workers. There is some tax benefits for low income and some medium income families in Canada, but nothing that we can all run around up and down the street and cheer about. I think those are just cookies to keep the masses happy. But on the big picture, it's a lot more about plans and planning to spend money. But we got a plan, but we have to execute. And I don't see the execution portion happening unless there's major change to some of the restrictions that are preventing our infrastructure from being built. It's going to be interesting to see is these phase two or the second list of infrastructure projects that are going to be announced, because the first ones were really nothing burgers. They were basically facilities that were already there. They were just being modernized, facilities that were being expanded, or facilities that were mothballed and they're bringing them back to operational. So nothing really being built. So it was a lot of show and no go. The second list is going to be interesting because there were no pipelines included in the first list. Now there has to be some pipelines on the second end, or some kind of manner of working towards it. There's got to be something there for BC with the liquid gas. So there's got to be some movement on these big projects. The Ring of Fire in Ontario, there is a road being built up to the Ring of Fire. That project is going to be a decade before we ever see anything from that. But they are building a road headed towards the Ring of Fire, which is a area in the north of Ontario that is apparently very rich in mineral, precious metals, which is a good thing. We have a lot of land and we could probably make a lot of money. But I can tell you right now, Premier Ford is not happy with this budget, nor is his finance minister, and we'll hear more about that in the coming days. I think there's going to be a lot of talk about this budget for a week. The government swings on the balance, though I don't think there's a real threat. I don't think anybody wants to be going to the election box by Christmas. I think that's a no-go. But at the same time, if I was the Liberals, I wouldn't be taunting the opposition to call an election and defeat the government, thinking that it's a sure thing that they're going to win a majority. I think that's bad politics, and we'll see what happens. But we'll talk more about tomorrow about the disturbance that's going on in the House. So I'd like to know your thoughts about the budget. What did you hear that was good? What you didn't hear? What was left out? What you're upset about? And I will definitely reply to your comments as I do all the time. Thanks for watching. Be safe, and we'll see you on the next one.